Good evening, parents, caregivers, and community members. Thank you so much for joining tonight's course. If this is your first Parent Academy course, welcome. And for those of you joining us again, thank you so much for your ongoing support. We look forward to continuing to serve you and your families as we learn and grow together. My name is Ashley Vandenmyracker, and I am a Duval County Public Schools Parent Academy Specialist. And on behalf of the board, the superintendent, and the entire Team Duval, we are thrilled to bring you this event in partnership with the University of North Florida. Tonight, you will hear from Dr. Bess Wilson, an associate professor at the University of North Florida. She will present the course, Understanding Your Gifted Child, where you will learn invaluable information to support you, your child, and your family. If you choose to have your camera on during the presentation, you are welcome to do so, but we do request that everyone have their microphone turned off. Should you have any questions throughout tonight's presentation, please type them in the chat box or utilize the raise hand feature to let Dr. Wilson know that you would like to ask your question out loud. There's also been time allotted at the end of the presentation for questions and answers on camera or in the chat if you choose to hold your question until the end. Tonight's presentation is being recorded, so if you'd like to watch it again or share it with a friend or a neighbor, it will be available on the Parent Academy website later this week. Thank you again for joining us this evening, and with no further ado, I will hand it off to Dr. Wilson.
Hi, everybody. I'm so excited to see all of you here tonight, or at least see your names at the bottom of my screen. I'm so excited to talk to you about understanding your gifted child. So a few things. At the top of your screen, you'll see the tiny URL link and also the QR code. Both of those link to just the PowerPoint presentation. So if you wanted to download the PowerPoint presentation as well tonight, that's also open for you. So let's get started. A little bit about myself. I'm an associate professor and also the graduate program director in the College of Education at UNF. So I know we're all very excited to have this partnership with Duval County. I'm involved with the National Association for Gifted Children. I'm the Research and Evaluation Network past chair. I'm an associate editor for the Journal of Advanced Academics, and I'm a board member of the Innovation Collaborative, which is a nonprofit organization looking at the intersection of the arts, sciences, and humanities in education. The really exciting news is that a new edition of my book, Letting Go of Perfect, which is about perfectionism for parents, is going to be released in June 1st. So yeah, I'll have a link to that later too when we start talking about perfectionism. But I'm pretty excited about getting to share with you some new and the latest information about the research on perfectionism tonight. Additionally, I've got two kids, and they've both been identified as gifted, and they're and twice exceptional. So we'll talk a little bit about that later as well. And as we grow up, and as our kids grow up, I've noticed in my own parenting that the level of support that you get from parents changes, right? So when our kids are babies and they're crying in the middle of the movie theater, right? The other parents are pretty sympathetic and they want to help you, and there's not a lot of judgment about your child's behavior. But then as your kids grow up, there starts to be a little bit more judgment about, where your kid is or what they're doing or the behaviors they might exhibit. And I want this space that we have today to be a really no judgment zone, so that I want all of us to feel really comfortable sharing the types of struggles that we might have with our kids. Sometimes it's hard to share those with other parents when our kids are gifted and they're achieving a lot, because that other parents might be judgmental about that, or that you might feel like you're bragging. And in this space, we all know that our kids have different levels of achievement. And then sometimes, our kids exhibit really challenging behaviors and we need help kind of figuring out what to do. And I'm also here to help to talk about those struggling behaviors without any judgment about how that might reflect on you. So let's first talk about what is gifted. So you're here to talk about understanding your gifted child, but what does that even mean? When we And if I asked 10 different researchers in gifted education, what is gifted, I would probably get 10 different answers. So our field hasn't really come to a strong conclusion about what even the term means. I like to think about gifted as the potential to think at a greater capacity. So we have this kind of potentiality here that's maybe thinking faster, deeper, more creatively, in a new way, better than other kids, more engaged at a higher level. And that's typically measured by something like an IQ score. And we could talk a lot about the validity and reliability of IQ scores. There's a lot of evidence about them if we kind of accept that IQ is a construct. So when you get your child tested for gifted and they take the WISC or the KBIT, those are IQ tests, and that's essentially what they're measuring. Or I also consider kids gifted if they've demonstrated that capacity. So when we see really high levels of achievement, whether that's in an AP class or high grades on a test or projects or on the FSAs or the SATs, that to me also demonstrates giftedness, because you can't achieve at a high level unless you have the potential to achieve at that high level, right? However, if we look at the state of Florida's definition, it only talks about that potential, and it doesn't talk about that achievement level. So you might have in your household a kid who's achieving at a really high level, but they didn't, for whatever reason, their IQ score doesn't show that. And so they might not be identified for a gifted program, even though I might consider them gifted. And the Florida definition is very, very narrow. If we went to other states and looked at their definitions or looked at the ways that they identify gifted kids, we would find differences. So my point here is that in this conversation tonight, I'm not just talking to those parents with kids who have an EP and have been identified for services through the county. I'm talking to parents who see that potential to think at greater capacities in their kids, or who have seen that demonstration of that capacity in their kids. So when we talk about gifted kids and their emotions, when I talk to parents, one of the number one thing that I hear parents talk to me about are their emotional kind of well-being, right? Because that's what we're concerned about as parents. And what we know is that there's no greater incidence of health issues. So sometimes if you just Google gifted kids online, you'll come up with, a gazillion blogs that may or may not have any scientific evidence behind them. And sometimes you'll see that they'll make claims that gifted kids might have more allergies, or they might have greater incidence of, gastrointestinal or stomach issues or things like that. But really, the evidence shows that there's no greater incidence of any kind of health issues with gifted kids. That gifted kids, have allergies just like every other kids, but it's not due to their intelligence. It seems like a weird thing to have to say, but blogs. Or allergies, or psychiatric disorders. So we know that gifted kids can have things like autism, ADHD, depression, anxiety, social maladaptation, but they don't occur at a greater incidence among the gifted population due to their IQ. That they happen kind of at the same rate as every other kid. However, they might manifest differently at times. So, for example, anxiety might be heightened when we put gifted kids in a really high pressure environment, like a really academically oriented school, and that might increase anxiety among some kids, right? So those two things interact with each other. So if you have a kid who's kind of experiencing psychiatric issues, or you think there might be a problem, I always encourage you to try to find a provider who also understands their giftedness, because those two things can interact at times. But today I'm going to kind of talk about 4 areas that are common issues for gifted kids: underachievement, perfectionism, multi-potentiality, and stress and anxiety about the future. But I want to stop just for a second and make sure that I don't have any questions. I feel like I'm going really fast. Okay, I don't hear any, so that's good news, I think.
I don't see anything in the chat, so I think you're good.
Perfect. Okay. So let's talk about underachievement. So underachievement is a discrepancy between the ability or potential of a kid and their actual performance. So what we have to think about here is that gifted kids oftentimes have a huge amount of potential, right? So what kind of discrepancy would be acceptable, right? So while my kid might be capable of getting a 100 in every single assignment because they're brilliant, is getting, an A minus an acceptable level of underachievement? In my view, it probably is, right? Or even a B or a C. So you kind of have to judge with each kid, what is underachievement really, what does that really look like for you? And how big does that discrepancy have to be for you to be upset or worried? And for me, the kind of things that I would look for to be worried about underachievement would be a sudden drop. So if a kid's been coasting along doing really well and then all of a sudden I saw a drop, that would be cause for concern. Another one is if the child themselves is feeling anxious or worried or upset about their achievement, or if it's causing them distress. And the third would be if that underachievement is then going to ultimately affect their kind of life choices and their ability to do the things that they want to be able to do. So if I'm making all C's and my goal is to become, an astrophysicist, those C's might not get me into the college that I want to that I want to get into in order to really pursue my career. So that's when I start to kind of worry about this underachievement for people. And kids really do have this right not to be gifted at everything. So if my passion is astrophysics and science, then maybe it's okay that my English grade isn't quite as high as my science grade, right? That even though I probably maybe could work as hard in English, if it's not my passion, I also kind of deserve a chance to relax a little bit too. So there's kind of 4 underlying causes of underachievement. This is coming from Dr. Sigley and Dr. McCoach, who I studied under at the University of Connecticut, and they're fabulous people, by the way. But the first one is this kind of question of, am I smart enough to do well? So sometimes kids underachieve because they doubt their own abilities to do well. And so it's better to kind of not try than to try and fail. So this goes to success attribution, which is, what do I attribute my success to? For really healthy people, if I do well on something, I attribute that to my own abilities, my own work. And if I do poorly, then I kind of, say, well, maybe that was luck, or, I had a bad day or something, right? But it becomes maladaptive if I start to think that, well, maybe it was just lucky that I'm here, or it's just lucky that I'm making good grades, and maybe I don't really belong here. Or they start to attribute, and this kind of goes to mindset theory here, is they attribute their success to being smart and getting it right away. And so then when things start to become hard or difficult, they kind of shut down, because then they start to wonder, maybe I don't really belong here. It's been so easy for me all along the way, and now I'm really having to study or learn these things, and maybe I'm not smart enough to be in this class because I don't know this already. Which is something that is kind of unique to this population. Most kids, learn with the grade level that they're in, and when we have a kid who's far above that grade level, so they've never really had to learn, at some point they do. And that might be in 5th grade. It might be when they start middle school. It might be, their first AP class in high school. It might not even be until they get to college. And that would be a real tragedy, because you really want kids to experience that struggle, to experience that challenge of work in a place where you're there to help and support them. So I want every kid in 1st, 2nd, 3rd grade to really experience that learning process and learn that they don't know the answer right away and that they have to work for it. And that's kind of what we owe kids, right? And then another reason why a kid might doubt if they're smart enough is twice exceptionality, which we talked about a little bit before. But twice exceptionality is when a child is gifted and they also have another exceptionality in place. So that could be something like ADHD or autism, or dyslexia or a learning disability, anything that's really kind of working at odds with their giftedness. So, for example, both my kids have been diagnosed with ADHD, and that really it presents a struggle because sometimes they can just, they can get what they need from school without kind of writing anything down and kind of forgetting lots of things. But it catches up with them when it comes to things like getting their homework done or remembering about projects. And it can be frustrating because they have the intelligence, they have the knowledge, but sometimes those executive functionings don't quite work in sync. And so anytime we have that disconnect where there's something else preventing a child to reach their full potential, that can cause underachievement. So when I see parents who are really struggling with their child's underachievement, or I see a kid who's really struggling with underachievement, the first thing I always ask is, have you thought about a twice exceptionality? Have you thought about another diagnosis that might be preventing them from achieving as highly as they could? And because if we can rule all that out, then other things can help. But if you can't, you need to be able to provide those accommodations and those supports to help them through those exceptionalities as well. The next one is kind of like, why try? So why would I be motivated to do this thing? So I like to think about my younger brother here. He's a very talented computer technician now, but in high school, he wasn't so motivated by school at all. He figured that if he made a C, he was doing just perfectly, and he hadn't put in too much effort in school. That would be a waste of time, but it was enough to get by. Sometimes he miscalculated and got a D, and then it was that was bad. But and he spent a lot of his time in high school building chainmail out of little pieces of metal, which if only his teachers could have captured that motivation that he had. I mean, he had lots of intense concentration and interest in things. It just didn't happen to be the things that school was interested in. So as a teacher, and as parents, we want to try to figure out, how do we increase that motivation for kids? How do we connect what we're doing in school to what the kids value? So sometimes, and the great thing is, gifted kids are really smart, so we can have these conversations with them. So I like to try to explain to kids that school's like a game, and we have to play the game of school. We have to submit the homework assignments and take the tests and fill in the bubbles on the answering sheets, because that's how we get through the levels to get to the end, to get to do the things that we really want to do in life. And if we can follow all the rules of school and play this game of school, it's not that school is valuable in and of itself, but by doing school, then we get to do the things that we really want to do in life. And sometimes that helps. Sometimes getting to explain why it's important and why we do these things helps. And kind of also validating, yeah, you're right. Like the FSA, it doesn't have a lot of intrinsic value, but why is it important for the school, for the kids, for the state, etc.? Sometimes that can help. The next one is about the environment. So can I be successful in this environment? So sometimes we think about this cause of underachievement when we think about populations of students who aren't the norm for the school, or who are in the minority. So if you don't see your culture or people like you reflected in the gifted environment, or in the school that you're in, or in the classroom, you might not feel like it's a place that you can be successful. So as parents, we have to try to build that community and help our kids see the value and develop those strong ties to the people in their classroom, and also the school. And a lot of that is also as parents helping kids make those decisions about where they're going to school and what programs they're going to be in. So some of you guys might be 5th grade parents right now thinking about what middle school your kid's going to go to, or middle school parents thinking about high school next year, or even elementary school parents thinking about which elementary school is the right choice. And now that we have so much choice in Duval County, choosing that school environments can be kind of tricky, right? So we have magnet schools that have gifted centers, and we have neighborhood schools that have gifted academies within them. And the key for most kids is trying to find that match of what's the appropriate level of academic challenge, with teachers that are supportive and a place where they'll feel connected to the people at the school. Because without this school environment and classroom community, kids won't be successful and they won't necessarily achieve and thrive in the ways that they could. And then the last one is really, how do I put this all together? So sometimes we assume that just because a kid's really smart, that they know how to do school things. And unfortunately, our gifted kids oftentimes kind of miss out on developing these skills. So if I go through school and I am reading way above grade level, then I never really had to learn how to read something that's hard. And at some point, I'm going to get to a text that's hard, right? Whether that is, in my AP English class or it's in my college level physics class, I'm going to have to learn reading comprehension at some point. And I might not have ever had to really read a textbook for knowledge, for content, because I could kind of just pick it up on my own when I was younger. So sometimes we have to really teach those study skills to gifted kids. The good news is they'll pick them up really fast, but we can't assume that just because a kid's smart, they have those skills. Another one is kind of those organizational skills, keeping track of assignments, all of those kind of organizational, keeping track of things. And then self-regulation is another big one. And that's this idea of being able to control yourself to do the things you need to do. So if I have my phone next to me, am I able to do my homework, or am I just going to be checking my phone every 5 minutes? And if that's something that's hard for you as an adult to do, think about how much harder it is when you're, 12 or 13 and your, frontal lobe of your brain hasn't fully developed yet, right? So we need to help our kids develop those self-regulation skills, because the goal is, right, by the time they're 18, 19 and off to college, that they can have a phone next to them and still do their homework, right? So it's that gradual release of those skills as well. And all of this came from this book, Motivating Gifted Students. It's just a great little short book on all of these concepts if you want to learn more in depth. So I have a link here and also the QR code to the book about underachievement. So I'm going to go on to the next slide, which is perfectionism, which is one of the topics that I really like to talk about. I just wrote that book about it, and it's been about 10 years since we did the first edition, and the research around perfectionism those last 10 years has really exploded. In fact, I think I was doing a literature review just looking at the research articles, and in the last year, over 10,000 articles were published with the word perfectionism just in the title. So just an enormous amount of research coming from all sorts of different areas of psychology, sports, social psychology, of course, school psychology and kids, and then a lot of kind of clinical psychology as well. So it's a really interesting, kind of fascinating place to be, and really thinking about how that affects gifted kids in particular. So a lot of researchers like to talk about healthy versus unhealthy perfectionism. So this idea that we might hold high standards for ourselves, and that's kind of what we want gifted kids to have, but it becomes unhealthy when those standards become unrealistic or impossible to hold, right? That we want kids to gain pleasure from working hard at difficult tasks, to feel good about a job well done. But when it's perfectionism, even though you've put in a lot of effort, you still kind of nitpick and see all the things you could have done better. So you're kind of left unsatisfied after hard work and effort. Healthy perfectionism is being able to relax those standards depending on the task. So if it's a rough draft, then I know that I can have mistakes in it. I know it'll get better. If it's just a homework assignment versus a final project, being able to say, prioritizing and being able to relax those standards to create a healthy life and work balance. And then healthy perfectionism is when we have personal standards and our motivations based upon those standards, concentrating more on the process. versus unhealthy is when a child or a person's really motivated by the external evaluation of the product. So I'm looking for that grade or that that approval from someone else rather than being satisfied with my own work. And it's that difference between mastery versus performance oriented. So I want to learn how to be happy with learning things and doing things for my own benefit rather than being really concerned about that end product. So it's the difference between being conscientious and having just a generally low self-esteem, and that's what we see with unhealthy perfectionism. So some benefits of healthy perfectionism, having those high standards, is that we see kids with this type of kind of good perfectionism really being involved in that revision process, setting great goals, being motivated, and just getting pleasure from hard work and seeing kind of the results of that work. And when we start talking about the negative consequences of that unhealthy perfectionism, it's that kind of fear of failure and procrastination. Dichotomous thinking means that you've either failed or you've done great. So that's that kid that comes home and just sobbing because they failed a test, and then you look at the paper and it's like an 89. And you're like, well, an 89 isn't actually failing, right? That's actually a B. But that dichotomous thinking is either I did well or I completely failed. I mean, kind of that low self-esteem, external rewards leads to workaholic tendencies, underachievement, mistakes, anxiety, and it can go, it can get worse in the sense that it can also lead to really clinical types of depression and anxiety. It's been linked to eating disorders and more serious clinical issues. So if you see your child kind of going in that direction, it's really important to get like professional help and seek out, I know there's great teams at every school to help get that ball rolling if you're kind of seeing those tendencies in your child. Also, your primary care physician is another great resource if you're looking for some kind of mental health help. But let's talk about in the book that Jill and I wrote together, we talk about some different ways in which you might see perfectionism happen in your child. So the first one is this academic achiever. This is the kid who is so concerned about the grade that they only focus on that final grade, and if they get a 98, it's like, well, what question did I miss? Not what are the other questions I got right? And it's these unrealistically high expectations that nothing less than 100% almost is good enough. And unfortunately, our culture really breeds this kind of view. We think about GPA in high school and how competitive it is to be at that high rank and how much it's rewarded. Oh my goodness, that's my phone. We want to think about the ways in which we as a family and as caretakers and as parents, we can try to mitigate the ways in which this academic achiever kind of aspect could be unhealthy for our kids. The next one is the accuracy assessor. And this is the kid who just redoes and redoes and redoes work every time there's any kind of tiny mistake. And is so concerned with all those little details that they kind of miss the big picture. They just might give up, or they rub a hole in their paper because there's so much erasing, right? And they just really can't move on to make it more like their ideal. And this can just become so burdensome for a kid to try to make everything perfect that either they spend hours and hours on their homework, or they just kind of give up because they can't make it perfect. Which kind of leads us to the next one, which are risk evaders. These are the kids who avoid situations where they might fail. So a kid who is brilliant but doesn't want to pursue an AP or an IB or an ACE or an early college curriculum in high school because what happens if they try that and they don't do well? I'm not gonna join the math team because what if I don't do well, and then everyone will see and I don't want to make that kind of failure. Or I'm not going to raise my hand in class because I don't want to get the answer wrong, right? It's that they kind of choose not to attempt the task. They choose to take themselves out of it. Also, sometimes we think about this also with little kids and their kind of what we call asynchronous development. So I might think about being like 3 or 4 years old and having just this great idea for a story, but you don't necessarily even have the words yet to describe all of these great ideas you have, or even you don't have the fine motor skills to write them down or to draw your picture the way you see it in your head. And that can become really frustrating for kids who have this idea, but they just can't make it happen the way they want it to, the way that they see it in their brains. And so that can also kind of cause this kind of tension for perfectionists. And then the controlling image managers are kind of along the same lines. They want everyone else to see them as perfect. Their image is really important. So they might purposefully manipulate the situation so that they can still keep that facade of perfection up. So maybe they throw the game, or they call in sick, or they just don't attempt it, but they in a way in which they can say, well, I could have if I'd wanted to, or I didn't try that day on my work, but if I had really tried, I probably would have done fine. And the last one is the procrastinating perfectionist. And we touched on this a little bit with our underachievement students, but this is the student who puts off everything until the last minute. And it's like if I keep it in my head and I have this idea, and I'm afraid that if I put it on paper, it won't meet my standards, right? So there's a little bit of anxiety that might even be subconscious here with a student. They might not be doing it on purpose. It just might be, this anxiety and fear of starting. Another thing that can happen is that that if they do start late and they do it at the last minute, then if it doesn't turn out perfectly, they kind of have a built-in excuse for why. Well, I just didn't have enough time to finish it. If I started earlier, it probably would have been perfect. So it kind of gives them a way out of managing their perfectionist tendencies. So these are some of the ways in which we see perfectionism kind of manifesting in kids. But I guess as parents, you're probably wondering, like, okay, well, now I know this. What can I do? So as parents, there's quite a few strategies. You can de-emphasize grades and celebrate learning and growth, especially for those academic achievers. Really taking time at the end of the 9 weeks, but before you look at the report card. And that's kind of hard now with focus, but celebrating the learning and growth that happened, not the grade that ended up as a result. So giving chances to talk about how, I'm not, I love that you make good grades, but what I'm really proud of is how much you've learned this year in 5th grade. I love this project that you did on, this faith on the planets. It's amazing. Tell me more about what you learned about Saturn. Like those kinds of things, rather than look at that, you got a 100, The next one is being an example in your own mistakes and choosing books and movies with flawed protagonists. So just kind of showing your kids that everybody makes mistakes, and being really transparent, honest, and open about that will help them kind of know it's okay. So bringing home stories from work, like, gosh, you know what I did today? I was really embarrassed, but I got through it, and this is what happened. A lot of times when we have, especially those procrastinating perfectionists who put things off to the last minute, and then the day before the big project's due, they come to you like, oh my gosh, Mom, I have a project due, and so and they're kind of panicking and they're upset, and they're that's not the best time to be like, well, you really should have told me about this 3 weeks ago, because they're not listening, they're upset. So so what I try to do, and trust me, this has happened many times in the Wilson household. We take it. Let's take 5 minutes and do some breathing. Let's relax. Let's calm down, because if our adrenaline's pumping and we're in a state of anxiety, we're not going to be able to concentrate. Then we talk about, okay, so if we had had all the time in the world, here's what you would have liked to have done. But now that we only have, tonight, let's change our plans and adapt to what could be done in the amount of time that we have. And then, we get through the hump and we get it all turned in. And then later we talk about kind of what went wrong. We try to do like a little analysis. So next time, in an off-peak time after the assignment's been turned in, how could we plan for this better? And checking in with your kid a lot, making sure that they're not kind of forgetting projects. Discussing asynchrony. So the good thing about gifted kids is they can understand things. So when you see your child frustrated because they just can't do something yet, talk about it. Say, yeah, I see that you're frustrated. And you know what? Someday you will be able to do these things. So, and kind of giving them voice to express the frustration that they're feeling. And I love, as families, doing activities that no one's good at or that you're not good at, and just having fun. Applauding your child's willingness to compete rather than whether or not they won, kind of thinking about ways in which you can stretch yourself and your family and your children to do things that are out of their comfort zone, so that they're not worried about being perfect or competing or doing the best from everyone else. They're just worried about themselves and kind of and getting better or just having fun. So, like I mentioned, this is the cover of the new edition of the book. It has a lot more resources than the last edition, and it's more up to date. So I'm pretty excited about it. Are there any questions about perfectionism? I know I'm going really fast, and it's because I want to make sure that we have lots of time for questions at the end as well. So don't see any. So I'm going to go on to the next one, which is multi-potentiality. And multi-potentiality is having lots of areas where you're really talented and just not really being sure which way to go. And we see this kind of idea of being an overachiever, overcommitted, or just an enormous amount of stress about fulfilling potential and being pulled in lots of different directions. And our gifted kids, when you're smart, you're kind of smart in lots of things. And it's oftentimes hard for our kids to figure out where to go and how to prioritize their lives and what's important or what they want to do. And the stress can come from lots of areas. Sometimes it comes from us as parents. Sometimes unknowingly, we kind of put pressure on our kids in ways we don't realize. Sometimes it's from teachers and coaches that they don't want to let down. Sometimes it's from their peer groups, depending on who their friends are. And sometimes it's really just a personal sense of, I maybe owe it to the world almost to fulfill my potential. So how do I manage that? Or, and so it's not always, an outside external force. Sometimes it's within the kid. So what can I do when I see my kid really struggling with ways in which they could be really brilliant in lots of areas? So doing some soul searching, asking the kid, not what are you good at, because that could be lots of things, but what do you truly enjoy? What brings joy, right? And Marie Kondo's kind of sphere there. Just because you're good at something doesn't mean that that's something you have to pursue forever. And then the other thing that I found really helpful for my family is to set limits. And whatever that looks like for your family. So for my family, my kids, it was kind of one in-school activity, one out-of-school activity, and that was kind of the limit to what our family could kind of handle. But I am my friend, she has 3 kids and they're super active, and their limit is one activity per night. So she's driving all over the place, but her kids kind of thrive on that energy and having so much to do all the time. So you really kind of have to know your kid, know if that would be having downtime is important for them to kind of recharge, or if they get energy and excitement from being involved in lots of different things. So just kind of thinking and sorting that out for each child in your family, actually. And then emphasizing quality over quantity. So really delving deep and becoming passionate and expert in one thing will be better in the long run than having just lots of things that you're kind of surfacely interested in. That's not to say that, lots of kids really benefit from trying lots of different new things, and that's totally fine too. to explore and try out. I mean, you definitely don't need to have a 5-year-old commit to what they want to be passionate about for the rest of their lives. But also knowing when it's time to give something up if they've moved on. How do we help our kids develop the skills that they need for success? So those transitions, whether that's from kindergarten or from preschool to kindergarten, or 5th grade to 6th grade, or 8th grade to 9th grade, or 12th grade to college, those are really difficult times for kids. And it might be the first time that a kid, experiences, I'm going to say quote unquote failure, because lots of times that failure isn't like an actual F. Lots of times it's like a B. But it's like kind of that first time that a kid experiences struggle. And that can be a time where there's a real identity crisis for a gifted kid. Everything's always come really easily, and then all of a sudden it doesn't. And it might question really who they are as a person. I've always been the kid who understands things immediately, and now who am I? Or maybe I'm not as smart as I thought I was, or the things I'm good at, I'm not good at anymore. And there's been a lot of research in this with women in STEM fields, that this is kind of that, it's that resiliency, the ability to kind of take that failure and move past it, that keeps women in that pipeline. And I think it's probably true for lots of kids in lots of areas. But how can we help kids kind of get over that? And honestly, I think the best way to do that is for them to experience lots of failure. So having them challenged at an early age and experiencing that, oh, this is what it's like to study, this is what it's like to do, can really help with, you don't want their first kind of identity crisis to be, their freshman year of college when they're away from you, right? And just helping them know that failure is okay. That's how we get up and we get stronger and we learn from. And then once they're past that, then helping them kind of brainstorm, well, why were you unsuccessful? You failed that test. I mean, did you read the textbook? Sometimes it's as simple as, oh yeah, you have to study, and some things like that just might not have occurred to some of our gifted kids. Next one's organization. And honestly, this is something that probably we all kind of struggle with. And certainly during the pandemic, it's been like uber important. But helping kids, explicitly teaching those strategies and finding one that works. I think with my daughter, we went through like a gazillion different organizers till we've kind of hit on one that worked for her. And whether that's a wall calendar for your family, a planner that's written down, or an electronic planner. And finally, we settled on, she took pictures with her phone of the whiteboards where the teachers wrote down the assignments, and that was the way we kept track of things, and it worked for her. So we have to really work with our students to figure out a way to help them be organized, and those aren't skills that they naturally have, and sometimes we just assume, and I think teachers assume that because they're in a gifted program, because they're in an AP course, or because they're in a GATE academy, that they have these skills, and it's just not the case. And a lot of times, especially in those areas of transition, 6th grade, 9th grade, freshman year of college, are the times in which parents might need to provide that a little bit more support there. And sometimes it's, like I said, sometimes it's of papers, folders, binders. My favorite thing in the entire world are, you can buy a binder kind of that has pockets. It's like a series of pockets in it, so that they can just slide the papers in without holes. So they can kind of keep the papers somewhat organized by class, but it's all in one place. And the other rule is don't throw anything away. We'll just put it in a pile. And then we can throw it away at the end of the year, but just in case we need that sheet of paper again later, it's in the pile, So those are the kinds of things that worked for our family. And then explicitly teaching these study skills, like how do you study? How do you read a textbook for information? How do you create an outline? How do you take notes? And then teaching them about metacognition. So how do I calibrate my understanding? Which means when I read a passage, do I understand that passage? Do I know when I know something? And I think we've all probably experienced this at some point where, you've been listening to a lecture, or you're listening to NPR or something, and you're like, yeah, you're following. And then later you try to describe it to someone else, and you're like, oh, yeah, no, I didn't understand that at all. And we want to help our students hopefully recognize early when they don't understand something so they can go back and get that clarification. And so it's not the day of the test they realize they didn't understand the information, but it's, hopefully before then that they can calibrate that understanding. And then that executive functioning, the self-regulation, the ability to attend or to pay attention to things, to organize yourself, to prioritize tasks that are most important. But at this point in the lecture, I like to tell parents, we get so worried about the academics of our students and if they're going to make A's and if they're going to be at the top of their class. And I really think, especially in this pandemic, that it's really brought home to so many of us that the most important thing is our health. And if we can prioritize our students' sleep and their nutrition and their mental health, then everything else is less important. That we all just want to raise kind of healthy, happy kids. And that's our goal, right? So sometimes, we get into situations where the homework is causing, kids to stay up till 2 or 3 in the morning, and that's not healthy. And we as parents have to be the ones to stand up to the schools and say, no, this isn't okay. My 15-year-old needs to sleep. And if we don't stand up for our kids' rights, no one else is going to. So it's important to keep all of those in perspective, right? So even now when my kids are upset, having a bad day, my first questions are like, okay, did you sleep last night? Have you eaten anything? And until they do those 2 things, then that solves so many mental health crises. And have you had some water? So if we can take care of our basic needs, then the rest of it kind of also comes together in place. So as our kids launch, and whether that's into elementary school or into middle school or into high school, we have to help them think about the future. So, and sometimes as parents, and I know, my daughter graduated from Stanton, so I understand the magnet school, line there. We get so focused on, well, I need my kid to go to this elementary school so they can go to this middle school so they can get into this high school so they can get into the best college. And sometimes what we lose perspective on is, well, is that elementary school really a good fit for a kid? So I like to talk to parents about focusing on who is my 5-year-old or who is my 12-year-old right now, and what kind of environment is best for them. But then also helping your kids see that connection between short and long-term goals. So knowing that there are some consequences and there are some choices that we make that do affect, later down the line. I like this graphic about decision-making power. So when you're choosing, an elementary school, it's probably mostly the parent making that decision. But by the time that they're, choosing a college, that's if not 100%, mostly 99% your child's choice about where they're going to pursue studies, right? So in the meantime, we have to negotiate that. We have to figure out, how do I help my child make good decisions? And that's not by making the decision myself, but it's by having conversations and discussions with my kid and letting them be part of that decision-making process. And sometimes it's really hard as a parent to kind of give up that control. I know. But if we can involve our kids in that process, then everyone is going to be more successful. So that leads me to my last slide, which is my email address, and also the URL for the PowerPoint slides. I know some of you came in a little bit late. So we're recording this session, which will be available on the DCPS Parent Academy website later on this week, I believe. But the website that's listed here is just a copy of the PowerPoint slides if you'd like to reference them later. And my email address. I work for the university, and part of my job is service, and part of that service is community outreach. So if you have questions about gifted education or your gifted kid, please feel free to reach out to me.